After America is made on the lands of the Kure-Wurrung, Ngunnawal and Ngambri peoples, we acknowledge that they and their ancestors have cared for the lands, rivers and sea, and all living creatures for thousands of generations. We pay our respects to elders past and present and acknowledge that sovereignty was never ceded.
We are in a battle for the soul of America.
This is a fraud on the American public.
Hi, I'm Emma Shortis and this is After America. This week marks the second anniversary of the October 7 attacks on Israel by Hamas-led militants, which killed 1,200 people and took 251 people hostage. The Israeli government's response to that attack has levelled Gaza, created a famine, and even by conservative estimates, killed tens of thousands of civilians. Others put the number at well over 100,000 direct deaths. 2 years on, a UN Human Rights Council Commission of Inquiry has concluded on reasonable grounds that the Israeli authorities and Israeli security forces have committed and are continuing to commit acts of genocide against the Palestinians in the Gaza Strip.
It's found that Israel is committing 4 of 5 acts of genocide under the 1948 Convention.
It is now almost 2 years since Israel launched its military campaign in the Gaza Strip in October 2023. This has been the most ruthless, prolonged, and widespread attack against the Palestinian people since 1948.
After several failed attempts at brokering a ceasefire, the Trump administration, alongside Israeli PM Benjamin Netanyahu, announced a 20-point peace plan for Gaza. Negotiations did not include Palestinians, nor any of the Arab nations in the region that will play key roles in building and maintaining that peace.
But if Hamas rejects your plan, Mr. President, or if they supposedly accept it and then basically do everything to counter it, then Israel will finish the job by itself.
Israel would have my full backing to finish the job of destroying the threat of Hamas, but I hope that we're going to have a deal for peace.
Trump and Netanyahu demanded that Hamas accept the deal within days. Hamas has now partially accepted the deal, agreeing to free the remaining 48 hostages and saying in a statement that it was prepared to turn over the administration of the Gaza Strip to a Palestinian body of independent technocrats based on Palestinian national consensus and supported by Arab and Islamic backing. It has sought to negotiate over other terms. Responding on social media, Trump wrote that Israel must immediately stop the bombing of Gaza. At the time of recording, it has not. A ceasefire is desperately needed. This week, a YouGov poll of 1,500 Australians commissioned by the Australia-Palestine Advocacy Network found that the vast majority of Australians, nearly 70%, want Israel to end its assault on Gaza. A majority also supported Australia sanctioning Israel's government and military leaders. To discuss the prospects for Trump's peace plan, we're glad to welcome a new guest to the show. Antoun Issa is the founder of Deep Cut, a new independent Australian news and analysis outlet focused on democracy and international affairs. Before Deep Cut, Antoun spent 3 years as a journalist in Beirut, with particular focus on Syria and Gaza. He then relocated to Washington, D.C., where he worked for a US think tank, the Middle East Institute, before he joined The Atlantic as an editorial strategist. In 2020, Antoun returned to Australia and joined The Guardian, before resigning and founding Deep Cut. Antoun and I talked about the prospects for peace, the role of the United States in the Middle East, how power works in foreign policy, and opening up space for foreign policy here in Australia. We started by asking Antoun about Trump's peace plan.
Well, the first thing to take note is that if you want to have peace talks, you've got to have all sides at the table. And in this case, the one important side, Palestinians, weren't at the table when this 20-point plan was drawn up. Hamas came out afterwards and said they hadn't even seen the plan. So Trump and Netanyahu had announced it publicly before Hamas had even received a copy and were able to go over the details or agree or disagree and negotiate, as they have been through the various rounds of negotiations since the genocide started, right? So there'd always been work behind the scenes and proposals sent back and forth between, the US, the Israelis, Hamas via, Qatari mediators or Egyptian mediators, and something would be signed off and announced, and the Israelis would sabotage it. So that's just been the mode for the last 2 years. But the crucial element here was that Hamas this time wasn't even, there was no negotiations with Hamas over this 20-point plan before it was announced. So I think that's the first important piece of the puzzle. Before, sadly, the way, I guess the media landscape operates in the Western world is that, the US government will announce something by default, everyone runs it. And so it just got spread all over the world that, there's a peace plan, without actually interrogating, investigating, and uncovering and mentioning that it's not really a peace plan because one side was absent from the peace talks. That's my first takeaway. The second takeaway are the components of the actual peace plan, right? We have to understand the Israelis want total Hamas capitulation or Palestinian capitulation in Gaza, right? So they're the extremists of Israel who are growing more and more powerful within Israel have made their intentions clear that they want the entire Gaza Strip cleansed of the Palestinians there. They want to conquer it. Netanyahu so far appears to be on that bandwagon. He's definitely allowed the genocide to take place in such a direction to, destroy the entire Gaza Strip, to make it completely uninhabitable. And now with the current, attempts to take Gaza City, it's all designed to push the Palestinians out of the Gaza Strip. That is their intention, right? Now, they haven't been able to do that despite the mass killings that they've inflicted over the last 2 years, 680,000 people, according to an estimate by 2 Australian academics a few months ago. And that study I'll mention, just a sidebar, was of April 2025. So there have been daily killings ever since, right? So those numbers have gone up. But despite all that, the Israelis still haven't succeeded in vanquishing Hamas and the other Palestinian resistance groups. And we've got to take note that most of the destruction that the Israelis have been inflicting have been by distance, right? So it's been by air, it's been by drones, it's been by AI. And whenever they've sent troops in to actually combat, they've suffered casualties, and they're still suffering casualties. And that's probably one of the reasons why the IDF chief, who was handpicked to head the IDF by Netanyahu, was so adamantly kind of opposed to this plan of going into Gaza City.
But the Hamas plan, I tell you, it's amazing. You're going to have peace, if you think about it, peace in the Middle East for the first time in, they say, really 3,000 years. So I'm very honored to be a big part of that. Look, they've been fighting for a plan for years. We get the hostages back almost immediately. Negotiations are going on right now. Will probably take a couple of days.
The president answered my questions on text about his hopes for this nascent deal. I asked him, what happens if Hamas insists on staying in power in Gaza? The president said, complete obliteration.
So this peace plan is essentially surrender Hamas, disarm completely, and Palestinian resistance altogether, be completely demilitarized, disarm completely, allow the governorship of Gaza to be done by a board of peace, which is to include Tony Blair, who Mehdi Hassan of Zateo said should be at The Hague for war crimes in Iraq. It's demanding that the Palestinians surrender. It's not demanding that there be some kind of fair settlement at the end of the day. So it's hard to see why they would agree to this 20-point peace plan. And of course, if they reject it, the White House and Netanyahu will try to spin it as, Hamas has rejected peace, so let's just go full throttle. Well, they already are going full throttle, right? So, whether people are going to buy that spin, I'm not sure, because of trust. Israel is so isolated internationally. No one is listening to a word they're saying. You saw that at the UN General Assembly when everyone walked out on his speech. Trump, people listen to Trump because he's the head of the greatest power in the world right now. But in terms of trust in what they spin, it's hard for people to, I don't know, it would be hard for people to buy that, Hamas has rejected a peace deal they should have accepted. I don't think that narrative is going to work if Hamas does, in fact, reject this 20-point peace plan.
Yeah, which, you're right, does seem likely. You mentioned the inclusion of Tony Blair, former British Prime Minister in that, who did, advocated for the illegal invasion of Iraq in 2003. It almost seems like a joke that he would be on this so-called board of peace, headed by Trump himself. Is it even possible for the US and the UK to build trust with Palestinians and, of course, the broader region as well, like through those two men?
Well, I think, so I spent a few years in the Middle East covering as a journalist. And one thing you get privy to as a journalist in the Middle East is kind of like the corridors of power in the region. You go to conferences in Doha and Dubai and Abu Dhabi and, panel events. And, essentially what you discover really quickly is that the group of people that kind of run and make the decisions, the wealthy, the billionaires, the oil tycoons, the media tycoons, and, the kind of like the billionaire class in the Arab world and the Israelis and, the kind of, and the US and in Europe, they kind of all hover around each other. So it doesn't surprise me at all that this would be conceived, right? That amongst this kind of cohort and this clique of people who are engaging with each other on a regular basis, there'd be this idea that Tony Blair would lead or be involved in a board of peace, and maybe the Emiratis might contribute some troops to an international stabilization force, right? They are completely detached and removed from the reality on the ground within their own countries, and then also with regards to the areas that are impacted by their decisions, such as Gaza and the Palestinian territories. So none of this comes as a surprise. And I think it's important to keep that in note when we're talking about what do Arab partners or Arab other states think of these deals, right? Every family that runs the Gulf Arab states are all extremely wealthy billionaires who have made wealth based on the fossil fuel reserves they sit on. And they've made their wealth by aligning with the US and before that, Britain and essentially Western interests in the region. And they've been able to grow their power through this alliance with the West. And I don't see, so for them to kind of gravitate away towards that is not really going to, it doesn't seem feasible for them to do so, not in a significant way. So when they're engaging with the US, whoever's in charge of the US, but in this case it's Trump and the UK and so forth, and they're happy to play along. They'll have input for sure. Like the Emiratis are making it clear that they don't want the West Bank to be annexed, but they're happy to be partners with the US and the UK when it comes to, managing, governing, putting money in, helping with reconstruction. It comes back to my point. There's no surprise. But I think the important point here is that the Palestinians also have agency, right? And so they also have the ability to influence things on the ground and need to be considered in part. Of course they need to be considered. We're talking about their fate, right? They need to be at the table discussing. Now, in terms of material power, sure, they don't have it, right? Compared to maybe, obviously not the Israelis, they don't have a military to match the Israelis. They don't have the economic, financial wealth that the Gulf Arab states have. And the way they're being discussed in such a way, it's like, you don't have any material power, so we're not going to consult you because we don't need to consult you. And I think that's what is being misunderstood here, especially by the powerful, especially by the people like the White House and hovering around the White House, by the Israelis themselves, and by the Gulf Arab states, which is that just because you have this material wealth, you cannot discount the agency of the Palestinians. They have to be at the table to discuss and determine their own fate, because if they're not, and I think the lesson from the last 80 years of this story going on is that if you don't include the Palestinians and if you don't allow them to have real voice at the table, they're going to make themselves heard one way or another. And so if we go through this, if the US goes through with this whole board of peace and this 20-point peace plan that completely sidelines Palestinians and doesn't include them, doesn't give them any respect, I mean, it's just going to continue the story, because the Palestinians are not, they're a resolute people. They're not going to be discounted, disregarded, and treated as if they're a footnote.
Today I can confirm that at the 80th session of the United Nations General Assembly in September, Australia will recognise the state of Palestine. Australia will recognise the right of the Palestinian people to a state of their own, predicated on the commitments Australia has received from the Palestinian Authority. This is an opportunity to deliver self-determination for the people of Palestine in a way that isolates Hamas, disarms it, and drives it out of the region once and for all.
Some leaders have called, including the Australian Prime Minister Anthony Albanese, have suggested that political authority in Gaza be handed over to the Palestinian Authority. Is that a realistic option? Do you think that would maybe provide some agency or acknowledge some agency at least?
No, because the Palestinian Authority, if we look at the Palestinian Authority the way it's currently shaped, so the Palestinian Authority at the moment is headed by Mahmoud Abbas, who's been there since Arafat passed away 20 years ago. He's got an authoritarian-like grip over the PA, and he has zero popularity amongst the Palestinians. Like really, it's so low. Yeah. And he's very, a lot of Palestinians accuse him of being a collaborator with the Israelis. Again, like the Gulf Arab states, Abbas's power and prestige is derived directly from the occupation. So there is a security coordination agreement that the PA has with the Israelis, where they essentially kind of do part of their occupying monitoring of Palestinians in the West Bank on behalf of the Israelis. And it's always been a sore point for a lot of Palestinians that the PA would have this. So he has no legitimacy amongst the Palestinian population. He's a president by name alone. And so the idea that, this authority that has no legitimacy amongst its own people would be like, okay, you can run the Gaza Strip. I think it's an insult to the Palestinians because ultimately you have to give them, they have to have the say in determining their own affairs.
As you said, it was a lightning bowler, and it caught everybody surprised, I suspect, including, I know that the Fatah was caught by surprise, maybe Hamas, and they have yet to work out how they're going to form their government. But we won't be providing help to a government that wants to destroy our ally and friend. The elections are window panes into the actual condition of society. In other words, a lot of us were assuming that maybe life was this way or that way, and all of a sudden the people showed up to vote and said, we want something different. We want good, honest government. We want people to listen to our needs. We want people to provide services so our families can, grow up and be prosperous.
Let me just ask you this question. You say you can't deal with them, but would it be beneficial to try to talk to them, about moderating their stance, or is there just simply nothing to talk about?
Well, in essence, I am talking to them now.
Okay.
I'm confident they're listening to what you've asked me and what I'm answering.
We also have to remember that in the way this all started back in 2006 was because Hamas beat Fatah, which is the party of Mahmoud Abbas, in the Palestinian elections. They won. And they won in 2006, and the West wouldn't accept those results. They didn't accept that an Islamist party that rejected settler colonialism on Palestinian land would win a fair and square elections. So it was the West who rejected the democratic aspirations of the Palestinian people to begin with. And then we ended up with Hamas and Fatah having their internal feud and Hamas kicking out Fatah from Gaza and taking over the Gaza Strip, and then the Israelis imposing their blockade. Now, if elections were held tomorrow, would Hamas win? Probably. Who knows? If they did win, these decisions have to be respected, and if they don't win, those decisions have to be respected, right? So, we can't talk about democracy and giving Palestinians, self-determination if we're not willing to respect what the Palestinians want for themselves.
Of course, absolutely. And so does the United States. And I think that's why it's so important that you raise 2006 and the Bush administration's response to those developments, which, had zero interest in respecting the agency of Palestinian people then. And historically, of course, has been a huge problem that the West and the United States in particular has been, at best disinterested in genuinely understanding the region, and at worst focused on really violent domination. You actually spent quite a bit of time in Washington. Can you tell us a bit about your experience there? Given your expertise and your knowledge, it sounds like there's a huge disjuncture between that and what, policymakers are actually doing in the States.
Yeah, so the Middle East Institute is a think tank in the US that is designed to kind of, come up with recommendations for US foreign policy in the region. And it's, got a lot of ex-US diplomatic personnel floating in that building. And it was really eye-opening. It was part of the foreign policy, what Ben Rhodes, the former advisor to Barack Obama, called the blob. So I was in the blob.
It's such a cliche, but it's so true. It's so accurate.
Yeah, I did. Yeah, I spent some time in the blob, and I came straight from Beirut, right? So I came from covering the events on the ground as they were happening. And even just going from Beirut to Washington, I noticed not long after I arrived that there was a bit of a lag in terms of what people thought was happening in the region and what was actually happening in the region. And it was important because the people in DC often make the decisions that influence what's happening on the ground in those regions. And so there's a bit of a disconnect with actually, the realities. That was definitely the case with regards to Syria. That was definitely the case. This was after midst Arab Spring, right? They just weren't getting it. And as you soon come to realize, I think a big reason why they weren't getting it was because, as I was saying before, the kind of this class of power kind of exists in its own isolation, right? So you have think tanks that are funded by Gulf Arab states, Qatar, UAE, Saudis. UAE spends a lot of money in DC. You obviously have APAC. Essentially, it's just revolving doors and just constant people in and out of the administrations, people out of positions in UN positions or big NGOs or big adjacent kind of industries like the defense industry or whatever. It's the same class of people, and it's really not a lot of people when you think about it in terms of in the grand scheme of things, right? So you've got the people with the purse strings, and one example of that is Yusuf Ataiba who's an ambassador in DC from the UAE. He's a really well-known ambassador in DC, and he's going from event to event. He's throwing amazing events all the time. He's expanding influence however he can for the Emiratis in DC. And eventually it just becomes into personal relationships, right? So the Jared Kushners of the world and the Trumps of the world and the Clintons of the world all have relationships, personal relationships with, the billionaires behind the scenes who are, working with APAC and the Gulf Arab states and the billionaire class in the UAE and Qatar and the Saudis. They all have personal relationships. And that was the eye-opener for me in DC, that it's just the power is so concentrated in the hands of a few people. And then you have the swarm of, what do I say? How do I say this in a polite way? Maybe I'm not going to be polite. A swarm of grovelers who work as analysts and who work as journalists and who work and, reporters who jump on, who follow these leaders and important people all over the places and go to the Munich security summit to the Halifax kind of security summit and all these fancy security summits with all rub shoulders, the World Economic Forums, Davos, they're all hovering around each other all the time. And the grovelers just want status. They're careerists. They end up on CNN, BBC, giving their talking points of what's happening in, Palestine, Syria, Lebanon, Turkey, Iran. And they all have faces like mine. They all come from the region. Some of them are white. But they all share the same, they're all careerists at the end of the day. That's pretty much DC. And these people end up making decisions that, impact so many people, but they're so far removed from the experiences of what it's like to live as a commoner. So when they are doing a deal with Palantir or someone else to kind of help Israel, identify targets through AI and blow up a few buildings, they're so far removed from the experiences, the human experiences of the people suffering in that building, that they just have no register. It doesn't register to them.
No, they spend a lot of time denying the power that they do have, pretending they don't have it.
Yeah, right. Yeah. But it doesn't even register to them, I think, even the depravity of it. They're not even conscious of it because they're so far removed from the experiences of ordinary people.
Yeah.
That's DC. That is DC. It is, it's
totally
the
is,
King's
yeah.
Landing of the world. It is, it's just full of grovelers, careerists who do not care about anything except their own kind of like where they're going in life, essentially.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's bleak, but it's so accurate.
That's power though.
It absolutely is. But you from DC then you came back to Australia. And started covering a lot of Australian foreign policy. How was that shift?
Oh, well, I was at The Guardian for 4 years, and I wasn't, and you might have tested this as well. Like Australia doesn't really have like a big foreign policy industry, right?
No, it's a pretty small closed shop. Yeah.
Even in the media though, and I found that really astonishing when I got here. Like when I first arrived, The Guardian Australia didn't have a foreign affairs correspondent. They got one during my time there. But even, we don't talk about foreign affairs, not even from an Australian lens, to the same degree that the Americans would, or if you go to Europe, these European countries would. Like, I lived in France for a bit as well. Even the French, they're very attuned to what's happening, because a big part of French media engages with foreign affairs. We don't in Australia. We're very insular. And I found that challenging when I first got here, back after 4 years. And I only started getting back into foreign affairs after I kind of left The Guardian, which was last year.
Mm-hmm.
And a big reason is because I felt like there is a need in this country to talk about foreign affairs in a really dedicated way that actually gives it weight and value as an issue that everyone should be engaged in. Because ultimately also it's our tax dollars, right? Like we've just seen, Albanese government got elected in 2022, got re-elected in 2025. Defence spending has just gone up since Albanese has come into office.
And it's likely to keep going up as, Trump demands that it does.
Exactly. But while defence spending goes up, we're not spending much on housing. We're not spending nearly enough on healthcare and Medicare. We're not spending enough on public schools. We're not spending barely anything on universities anymore. The infrastructure is lagging in this country where, it's all related. And I think there's a greater awareness now amongst Australians that, hey, if we're putting money towards the military, what's left for us in terms of our quality of life? And so people need to be engaged with foreign affairs. People need to be following where their money is being spent to justify it not being spent elsewhere in the economy. So I don't think anyone in the mainstream media and Australian mainstream media is doing foreign affairs. Actually, to be honest, I don't think Australian mainstream media is doing anything a good service, with regards to any topic at the moment. But least of all foreign affairs. They don't have the expertise. The people who, there's no expertise in foreign affairs. There's no expertise in world affairs. There's very few in the media industry that have that expertise. And we need to start being engaged.
Mm. Yeah, and I think that we're both focused on trying to do that, trying to engage people and, open up a conversation about foreign policy to say that it doesn't exist in some different plane to the rest of policy. And actually we should, we can and we should be talking about it all the time. But, I think as we've kind of been discussing, the culture of foreign policy in Australia is so closed off, and it is so kind of grounded in this mythology, particularly about the US and the security alliance. And it's really, I don't know about you, but I find it quite daunting thinking about how to try and shift that, how we can try and change that. Do you think it's possible to change that culture and to open up that conversation?
You just have to barge through the door. That's my approach. That's why I started Deep Cut. Like I'm not interested in changing what mainstream media are doing because the mainstream media are not doing enough. And we've seen that with the genocide for the last 2 years. They're not even covering it properly. They're not even giving it the respect that you need to give it something as seismic in the international system as a genocide and how it impacts and complicates world affairs and how that relates to Australia's interests abroad. I don't even think that we've even articulated what our interests are in this country.
That's true.
Like,
yeah.
that
we do have an interest in like the maintenance of the principles of international law.
There is one thing about Trump's rhetoric over the last few years that I think is very applicable to Australia. He's the one reason why Trump is so angry and frustrated with allies, particularly in NATO. He calls them freeloaders. But I think if there's one big freeloader, it's been Australia. I mean, we have pretty much just surrendered our entire national defence to the United States. And in doing so, we've also just kind of like offloaded our thinking. We don't even bother interrogating, investigating, exploring what exactly our national interests are. We have just, especially on a global stage, we have just kind of offloaded and be like, you know what, America's not just our military, America's our foreign policy. We just won't even think about it. Whatever the Americans do, we'll just follow. And that's really, it's not that only that it's dangerous, because we can find ourselves falling into something which is happening right now, falling into a space where I don't think it works for us, right? With the US becoming increasingly authoritarian, increasingly erratic, inconsistent with the way it engages with the rest of the world. A government that kind of like is undermining international law, tearing it apart, not undermining, tearing apart international law at the seams. So it's dragging us into a pit where I don't think we're comfortable being in. And actually now the pit is being complicit in a genocide. Like when we signed up to the F-35 Joint Strider project over a decade ago, I don't think supporting a genocide was on the cards of doing that, right? So, but we set up this whole industry here as part of this supply chain. And now it's like, well, we weren't counting on this happening. What do we do? So, it's come to a point where before we even get to assessing who our alliances are in the world, we need to articulate, okay, what's our position in the world as Australia? Not as an attachment to anyone else, not being in an alliance with anyone else, but what are our specific interests? And I think what's really concerning for Australia is that the Europeans are having these conversations amongst themselves. They are already starting to have conversations about how do we take care of our own security without the US. We haven't even started asking the question. And these are questions these are discussions that we need to have. And I'm someone from the left saying this. Like, where are the right wingers who are all about Australia, Australia, waving the Australian flag, marching down the streets? Where are they?
Yeah, that conflation, I think, between American interests and Australian interests, where, it's widely, well, it's not even really examined, as you were saying, but the assumption is that, those two things are the same and
yeah,
they just aren't.
They're not.
Of course not. But I think, the work you're doing at Deep Cut and the clear appetite for that, I think suggests that almost kind of perversely Trump is giving us an opportunity, or prompting us maybe to really have this conversation in a way that we haven't before. So thank you so much for the work you're doing at Deep Cut. And of course, we'll link to it in the show notes, and hope that we can continue, Antoun, having this conversation. But we really, really appreciate your time today.
And if there's one thing I can say to listeners, talk about this amongst your peers, like even amongst family, whatever, like start talking about this stuff, because these are discussions that need to be had for our own security. And unless we start talking about it, we're not going to figure it out. Anyway, that's enough.
Thanks so much.
Thank you, Emma.
You can read Antoun's work at deepcutnews.com. And we'd love to hear your thoughts on the show. You can reach us via our email address, which is podcasts@australiainstitute.org.au. This episode was recorded on Friday, the 3rd of October. After America is supported by the Andrew Farron Foundation and produced by Angus Blackman. We'll be back next week. I'm Emma Shortis. Thanks for listening.